So a little bit of housekeeping announcement. May I request those who are already in the meeting room to kindly indicate the organization that you're in first, organization that you represent, and then the name that you want to be addressed during this session. Thank you. We hope to begin at 2:30 sharp. All right. I guess if we're having a physical event, this is when the drum roll starts. because we're 1 minute away from the event. So for those of you who have come in early, you have known by now, my name is Adam. I'm your MC for today. I'm from the UNICEF Malaysia. So you have also seen the program itself, right? So I've seen Dr. Rashid is also here already. So in about a minute, we will begin the session. Okay. Okay, so Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Very good afternoon. Salam Ramadan Karim. Salam Sejahtera. My name is Adam. I'm your MC for today. I'm from UNICEF Malaysia. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us in the launch of the Series 4 of the Families on the Edge study, which is commissioned jointly by UNICEF and the UNFPA. The study is conducted by DM Analytics, led by Dr. Muhammad Abdul Khalid. So without further ado, I will invite Dr. Rashid Mustafa, who is the UNICEF representative to Malaysia, to deliver his welcoming remark. Dr. Rashid, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam, very much. And thank you, everybody. Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Mustapa Mohamed, Minister at the Prime Minister's Office, Ms. Jayamala Samuel, our close friend, Assistant Representative of UNFPA Malaysia, distinguished guests, members of the media, friends in the government and civil society organizations. Assalamualaikum dan selamat datang to all of you. On behalf of UNICEF Malaysia, I would like to thank you all for taking time to be here today on the eve of Hari Raya Aidil Fitri for the launch of fourth and final Family on the Age report. From the outset, please allow me to thank Datuk Sri Mustapa Mohamed for his keen interest in this project, for his participation today, and for the time he has taken to meet us in several occasions in the last 1 year to discuss the findings and policy implications. Let me also thank our sister agency UNFPA for this close partnership in this challenging project. This study is a striking example of what we can achieve and do together when agencies work hand in hand. Finally, I want to congratulate and thank Dr. Mohamed and entire team of DM Analytics for their commitment to deliver such a high-quality research project. Your team's effort over the past year to continually adapt the project to what has been a highly dynamic is highly appreciated. Distinguished guests, this fourth and final report marks the closure of the successful and prominent research project, a project that I believe has delivered on its core objective of shining a light on the experiences of low-income urban families during the COVID-19 crisis. It is fitting that this launch takes place during the holy month of Ramadan, a time when we reflect on the needs of those who are less fortunate amongst us. I will leave Dr. Mohamed to share the detailed finding from the fourth and final survey and would like instead to turn to what the Family on the Age project has told us overall about how the prolonged COVID-19 crisis has affected low-income families and what we know about the situation of these families as Malaysia enters MCO 3.0. As the title of our report suggests, the experiences among the low-income families participating in the study increasingly look like the childhood board games, Snakes and Ladders. By the way, one of my favorite games still now. Over the course of the year, the families have, with remarkable determinations, creativity, and patience, sought to navigate a path through the crisis. As they have done so, families on the edge has highlighted the critical role that assistance from government, civil society, and Zakat have played in enabling role in to navigate weather of the storm and take tentative steps forward. Indeed, as you shall hear, by February this year, average incomes among the study sample stood only marginally lower than the pre-crisis, and many indicators of wider well-being had improved compared to previous survey rounds. But families on the edge has also shown how some families, particularly female-headed households, households affected with disability, and households reliant on informal or self-employment, have recovered more slowly and remain at risk of being left behind. Indeed, there is a real risk that latest round of restrictions, as necessary as they may be, will reverse the gain made by many low-income families over the first few months. We cannot afford to let this happen. Furthermore, the fourth survey from Family on the Edge also shows that this real life and ongoing version of snakes and ladders is starting to apply a real toll on mental well-being for women and children in particular. This has been true for many of us, but the impact of this uncertainty on families that were struggling to put food on the table even before the crisis is difficult to comprehend. Indeed, this final survey paints a disturbing picture of the impact on mental health. I repeat, mental health, with over about 1 in 5 respondents stating that they are depressed. That raised up to 1 in 4 among female-headed households. Meanwhile, almost half of the parents believe that their children's mental health has been affected. And around 2/3 of those parents reported that they needed a parenting advice on how to support their children throughout this period. Although the participants in the Families on the Edge study and hundreds of thousands, those similar families around the country, have demonstrated exceptional dignity and resilience over the past year, I believe we need to take these calls for help very, very seriously indeed. Parents and friends and partners, I will leave detailed discussion on policy implication to the presentation and panel discussion. But there is no question in my mind that we must maintain a focus on ending the grinding economic uncertainty experienced by low-income families. This can only be achieved through more sustained and reliable social protection for children, people with disability, older people, and self-employed. Friends online at home, UNICEF is the largest world's children's rights organization. We work more than in 190 countries and territories to reach the most disadvantaged children and family. We work for every child in the principle of leaving no one behind, and that includes all children from Perlis to Sabah, of all ethnic groups and races, citizens and non-citizens, migrants, undocumented, refugees, and most marginalized children found among all of them as children with disability. This year, UNICEF celebrates 75th anniversary in the midst of this pandemic, It is an opportunity to all of us to reimagine social policy that leaves no one behind. As this research has shown, the COVID-19 crisis is a child rights crisis. And as it sharpened our vision to focus our global priorities, equitable access to vaccines, access to education and digital learning, mental health and parenting, and climate and weather. We can only achieve these through a strong partnership with the government, civil society organizations, private sectors, parents, and of course with the children. And let's together make this recovery effect better and efficient. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashid. That was indeed a very short and very concise speech. So I will now invite Ms. Jayamala Samuel from the UNFPA. UNFPA is the UN Population Fund. Ms. Jayamala, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Adam. Selamat petang and a warm welcome to all of you. Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Mustapa Mohamed, Minister at the Prime Minister's Office, Dr. Rashid Mustafa Sawa, UNICEF representative to Malaysia and a special representative to Brunei. Distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of UNFPA Malaysia and Mr. Kabena Asante Nitiamo, the UNFPA Malaysia representative, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for taking time to be here virtually with us at the launch of the fourth and final Families on the Age report. Mr. Asante, the UNFPA Malaysia representative, who has been recently appointed, unfortunately is not able to join us today, as he is currently being transitioned to come to Malaysia soon, hence sends his apologies. Before I begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to the UNICEF team for their tireless and ever-present commitments towards driving this project forward, especially to Mr. Stephen Barrett, who has been at the heart of each of every report. Our acknowledgement also goes out to our fulfillment partner, DM Analytics, Dr. Muhammad and his colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, this report of the fourth phase of the Families on the Age study offers further insight into the lives of the Malaysian urban poor. The Families on the Age report, as much as it is a narrative on the lived realities of the urban poor during the pandemic fallout, we at the UNFPA has begun to see it as a data-driven perspective on the lack of social protection available for the urban poor. For example, it is not only their economic situation which makes them vulnerable, it is also lack of access and exposure to a systematic protection. The protection mechanism that has now been put in place by the Malaysian government are successfully helping to allay the worst of the pandemic's negative impacts. These measures were in fact necessary from long ago. It is thus our sincere hope that this mechanism and benefits will continue to be made available even after the pandemic is overcome. When it comes to the female-headed household survey, the report continues to show that they lag behind when it comes to income parity, childcare, employment, and access to opportunities. Female-headed households have a high unemployment rate of 16%, which is roughly 3 times higher than the national average. Meanwhile, unemployment among the male heads of household has fallen since December 2020. This can partly be attributed to a myriad of factors that can only be addressed by having a more gender-sensitive approach. For example, the lack of recognition of the care economy, the unpaid care work by female caregivers, means that women in this family, in the female-headed households, are stretched to the breaking point, trying to balance taking care of their vulnerable family members while making enough time for economic activities and paid work. Institutional recognition of the care economy is essential so that the subsidies and social safety mechanism can be put in place. This is particularly crucial considering the value and importance of caregiving and the ultimate goal of providing a more equitable benefit system for Malaysia's female-led urban poor households. This will then naturally take into account the intersectional socioeconomic factors affecting women, including but not limited to sexual and reproductive health and rights, childcare, elderly and convalescent care, education and maternal health, and more. All in all, ensuring a more gender-sensitive lens when it comes to policy planning and social protection mechanism will ensure that women with female-headed urban poor households will not continue to struggle in a quagmire of economic inequity, but instead be able to rise and lead their families toward brighter possibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, we at the UNFPA have always commended Malaysia's incredible policy and achievements over the years to proactively reduce poverty and ensure that no Malaysian is left behind, no matter their race, gender, creed, or economic background. This includes several key international commitments, in particularly the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals that will propel Malaysia's path forward over the next decade. Once again, on behalf of UNFPA Malaysia, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you here today. And it is my sincere hope that studies such as Families on the Edge will play a pivotal role in ensuring the well-being of Malaysia's most vulnerable populations, ultimately propelling Malaysia towards reaching a fullest potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jayamala. That's also another short and concise speech from Ms. Jayamala herself. Right, so now, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we now come to the moment of the highlights, which is the speech by Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Mohamed, the Minister at the Prime Minister's Department for Economy. So he has, prior to this, recorded his speech, and we will now listen from his recorded speech. Right.
Very good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Rashid, representative of UNICEF to Malaysia and Special Envoy to Brunei Darussalam, Ms. Jayamala, distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank the organizers, UNICEF and UNFPA, for inviting me to say a few words on the fourth series of their study entitled Families on the Edge. The objective of the study, as we all know, is to assess the impact of COVID-19 and the Movement Control Order on the urban poor. The study involves 500 households from Project Perumahan Rakyat or PPR within Kuala Lumpur and Selangor. Findings from this research have generated a lot of interest among government officials, the academic community, and civil society organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, the study found that low-income households are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 crisis, with female-headed households and households headed by people with disabilities reporting the deepest and most negative impact. The situation of these groups has improved since the first survey in May 2020 was conducted. Unemployment among heads of households fell from a peak of 25% to 12%, while unemployment among female heads of households also improved from 32% to 16%. Nonetheless, these levels are still higher than the national average, as a large percentage of them is involved in the informal sector. This is consistent with the government's own findings that Malaysians in the informal sector have been the worst affected by the pandemic. The study shows that we should all put more concerted effort in ensuring that these vulnerable communities have better access to social security and social protection. Indeed, according to the study, 45% of employed heads of households are not registered with either EPF nor SOCSO. Ladies and gentlemen, it is gratifying to note that most households have recorded an improvement in their income as a result of the various cash transfer programs under the government's stimulus packages. Median household earnings have recovered to below 5% of 2019 levels, compared to a one-third decrease from the initial stage of MCO in May 2020. While it is encouraging to note that income has improved, the study has highlighted another key area that the government must be cognizant of: the nutritional intake and access to education for children. The study uncovered a disturbing fact on nutrition, where 6 in 10 respondents were unable to purchase enough nutritional food for their families, and 1 in 3 respondents reported difficulties in providing enough money for their children to buy meals at schools. This is worrying, since any deprivation of nutrition for our children will undermine their capacity to grow, develop, and learn to their full potential. This deprivation is detrimental to child development and will have an impact on their future. During the pandemic, parents also reported considerable barriers to effective home learning, where only 35% had access to an appropriate device, while a majority relied on using smartphones to access online content provided by their schools. Nonetheless, 6 in 10 parents commended the government's EduTV program and said that the government's TV education program had been helpful to their children. Ladies and gentlemen, an aspect of the previous MCOs, which has been far too long under the radar, is the adverse impact it has had on mental health. From this study, 1 in 4 respondents reported being depressed. Parents continue to worry about the children's education and whether they can earn enough to support their families. The government, through the Ministry of Health, has set up the Mental Health and Psychological Support Services Initiative to help alleviate the impact of the pandemic on vulnerable groups. However, as families continue to be burdened by economic and social deprivation due to MCO as an effect of the rising cases of COVID-19, we will need to strengthen the provision of these support services to ensure that they are made available to the targeted groups. Ladies and gentlemen, the findings of the 4th series of the Families on the Edge study indicate that most families are gradually returning to the pre-COVID income levels. The recent spike in COVID-19 cases, however, will have an impact on the socio-economic well-being of the vulnerable groups. The government, therefore, will continue to monitor the situation closely and come up with appropriate responses in the weeks ahead. While we continue to navigate the challenges stemming from COVID-19, we should not let our guard down in the effort to protect and promote the well-being of those who are most vulnerable. This study is important in guiding us on how to do just that. On behalf of the Government of Malaysia, I would like to thank UNICEF and UNFPA team for undertaking this study. The findings are very useful to the government and we'll take them into consideration when designing policies and programs for the urban poor, children, and the underprivileged. On that note, I hereby officially launch the 4th series of the Families of the Edge report. Thank you. Selamat Hari Raya Fitri. Maaf zahir batin. Sekian. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, members of the distinguished guests. The launching speech by Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Mustapa Mohamed, Minister at the Prime Minister's Department for Economy. Right. So we have heard from the leadership of UNICEF, we have heard from the leadership of UNFPA, and the leadership from the Government of Malaysia. So now I would like to invite Dr. Muhammad Abdul Khalid from DM Analytics, our lead consultant for this Families on the Edge study, to present his findings in more detail. Before I invite Dr. Muhammad, pass the floor to Dr. Muhammad, I would like to remind all audience that during Dr. Muhammad's presentation, we hope that you can highlight your questions in the chat function, because to ensure the smooth flow of his presentation, we will mute everyone except for him. Thank you. Dr. Mohamed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. Actually, the floor is not mine. The screen is mine. Now we're doing it online. Before I start, maybe I would like to say a few words. Hold on, let me share the screen. Okay. First of all, this report would not be possible without help from various individuals, in particular those academics that help us. From USM, Professor Noraida Endut from Center of Research on Women and Gender Studies, KiniTV of USM, she helped us tremendously. Professor Kamal Saleh from MER, Dr. Lihana and Dr. Gairu from UIA, Dr. Malati from Asian Business School, Professor Shafiq from UPM, Professor Samsul from UM, Fahana, Hawati, Jarod and Christopher from Kazanah Research Institute helped us to refine the study. We also appreciate the comments and suggestions from relevant ministries who share with us their comments. And finally, we cannot thank enough the support and commitment of the awesome team from Unicef and UNFPA, who has been very supportive in undertaking this research. This research, like the Minister mentioned, is the final report, is the fourth and final report. We have undertaken this for the past 1 year. We have done, this is a final series, number 4. We have interviewed 500 head of household in 15 flats in Kuala Lumpur. It's about 2% of the entire household in KL. We think it's a good sample. Household income survey did about roughly the same or slightly less from Dawson. What I would present today, what are the impacts of COVID from the last survey that we did, which was undertaken in the last week of February to the first 2 weeks of March, was the impact of COVID this household in both in fiscal and non-fiscal, as well as government impact of government intervention. I will end with what can we do, what are the policy recommendations. Oh, I'll skip this. The first findings, key findings that we find, like Minister mentioned, labor market has yet to recover. Unemployment rate currently is 12%, which is 2.5 times higher than pre-crisis level. It has improved from the height of last year during the first MCO, it has improved. However, compared to pre-crisis, it has not yet improved. In particular, the unemployment impact is affected the female-headed household and the disabled-headed household, much higher than pre-crisis and higher than national average. One thing that strikes us in terms of job opportunities impact to jobs is towards the adult children. Those children who are no longer in school, who stay with their parents in this flat, 37%, slightly more than 1 in 3 are not working. So in this low-cost flat, sizable number of young adults is not working. That is finding number 1. While labor market has improved compared to last year, but when we compare to pre-crisis, it is not yet recovered. And number 2, even those who work, what we find that underemployed, meaning we're working less hours, while it has improved slightly from 9 to 8%, but it's still higher than national average. And underemployment is much worse, dire among female-headed households. 1 in 5 is underemployed, and among person with disability, it is much higher. So not only female-headed household, there's higher unemployment rate, but those who work also work less hours. So double burden in terms of labor impact to these two vulnerable groups. And when we look at the dynamics in jobs, we find that the number of self-employed has increased slightly among female-headed household and among person with disability. It has increased since September last year. So because they cannot find a formal job, many of them have moved towards self-employment. And this is a challenge which I explain later. And the impact because of lack of jobs is not yet recovered to pre-crisis. We find that median household earning before transfers are still below than pre-crisis, before government assistance. Although we find among female-headed household and disabled, the earnings is almost on par, and we find it right precisely because their earning is very low, almost at minimum wage level. And therefore, when you look at overall poverty rate, has poverty improved? Yes, it has improved from MCO 1.0 in May last year, but overall, it has not yet improved compared to pre-crisis. Before crisis, it was 44%, and now it increased slightly to 45%. However, again, and this thing would keep repeating, impact to female-headed household, impact to disabled-headed household, the poverty rate remains high, 62% and 55% respectively. And when we look at children, what's the impact to children? In relative sense, if you earn half the median income in KL, at least 9 in 10 children live in relative poverty. So we can see the impact on jobs, the impact on income, and the impact towards poverty. Government assistance, one of the objectives of the study also to see the effectiveness of government assistance. Did I get it or not? Is it adequate? We find that government assistance helps. It does mitigate the impact of COVID to households. It does help. They make now government assistance make up about, on average, about 11% of overall household income, which is sizable. In particular, towards female-headed household. Among female-headed household, about 20% of their household income come from government assistance. Among disabled-headed household, 1 in 3 come from government assistance. So government assistance help, and it contribute better or effective towards those vulnerable. This is something that works, and we should acknowledge. However, despite the government assistance, we find that 4 in 10 still have to use the saving to mitigate the reduction of income. Majority of them acknowledge that government assistance help them to cope with financial difficulties, but almost a sizable number says we still have to use our savings. And when we dwell further, when we interview the mothers, we interview the fathers mostly, but we also have a small group to interview the mothers. There's still stories that have to pajak gadai. We find that have to borrow. We still have to find. We still find that incidents. While assistance to families quite extensive, DPM many receive it, but among assistance towards self-employed, it can be improved. A lot of them, majority of them, reports that they do not receive or has not received SME-related assistance. About 8 in 10 do not receive it. And when we compare with overall national number, because it was reported from Laksana report, and sometimes it is aligned. When you look how many got UNB assistance, Tekun assistance, Prihatin assistance, the number is quite small, relatively small. When we ask this household, why don't you get it? Majority reported that they has not registered with CCM, Companies Commission of Malaysia, or with local authorities. So they're not able to benefit from the assistance. For instance, would Malaysiakini able to get this assistance? To use a layman term, majority of Malaysiakini do not get this assistance, has not received assistance precisely because they are not registered with the authorities. Earlier, I mentioned that the female-headed household and the self-employed and the disabled-headed household, now many of them more becoming self-employed, more than become Malaysiakini. And this poses a challenge because we find that 45% of head of household do not have any social protection or insurance, especially among female-headed household. 1 in 2 are not protected, or disabled-headed household, almost 9 in 10 not protected. And when we slice it, Among self-employed, majority of self-employed do not have social protection. And it's going to be a challenge when they move, those who are unemployed or self-employed move towards self-employed, and therefore they do not have social protection. Then we ask them, what form of assistance is useful to you right now? Majority says that we need cash assistance. Only 1% says I prefer rental. Last year we asked the same question. Only 20% says I need rental assistance. But now majority said I need cash assistance. And many, when we look at how many that withdrew from ETF, it has more than doubled. And when we spend time with them, we ask them on the financial assistance, you get a mixed review. Some say yes, they receive it. Some say I do not get it. Some say, macam tadi I mentioned, some has to berhutang untuk membeli lauk nak makan sebab kadang-kadang bantuan tak cukup. This sometimes we repeat. But we also hear a lot that government assistance or receive information over there that they understand, they know about what assistance are available. So there's impact on jobs, which affected poverty. The government assistance help to mitigate that impact, although we find that it should be continued, it need to be expanded and more targeted, in particular towards self-employed. When you have a problem facing the head of families, that problem will translate to the children. To solve children issue is sometimes best also to address parental issues. And among children, we find that they are the most vulnerable. And it's consistent. Parents are worried, the children also worried. Majority, when we ask what are the current issues, they say, first, we want the kids to be in school. 80% said kid must go to school. Online learning poses a challenge, and we said, what kind of a challenge? Top three came about. I have no space, I cannot supervise my children, and I don't have necessary equipment. And we go further, we ask them, what equipment do you use? 88%, 9 out of 10 say I have to use smartphone. And it's repeated, there's much repeated says, I have only one smartphone, 3 kids go to school, and my problem happens when I go to work or when the school overlaps, or when the classes overlap, it's at the same time, then I have problems. So gadgets issues, not enough equipment. Not only parents find it difficult, the children also feel the same way. They find it difficult to focus, and the majority have lost interest to study. To us and to me personally, I find this very disturbing that children has lost interest to study. If education is a key towards upward mobility, we cannot afford them lose interest in education or in school. Government mitigate this by deploying education TV. Like Minister mentioned earlier, education TV helps. 60% find it helpful. However, 40%, still quite sizable number, find it difficult. And we say, why is it difficult? We say, because the children do not understand the content. While the program is there, the children find it difficult to follow. And apart from that, there are persisting challenge when children go back to school. Parents complain, we are worried. Children at home, they cannot study, but when they go to school, we also worried. There are expenses involved, that we have difficulties like the transport, tuition fee, and so on. But one thing that strikes us is that sizable number, 1 in 5 said, I have difficulties to provide a daily face mask to my kids. 1 in 5 reported this. So not only the existing problem that they have before COVID, but COVID posed additional challenge which had fiscal implication to the parents. And like I mentioned earlier, when we draft further, children emotion, devices, remote learning pose a challenge. Banyak yang tak berminat. This also another challenge that COVID posed is the ability to meet essential expenses. 1 in 2 consider they're not able to meet essential expenses. Although it has improved, the condition has improved, but those who say that we are unable to meet it, 50% say we cannot, unable to purchase enough food, we are unable to pay bills on time, or pay mortgage or rent on time. So while government assistance help, they're still vulnerable and they still face challenges in meeting essential expenses. When you ask them, what are your key concerns? What you worry about? Majority worry about 2 things: about putting food on the table and to give children a proper education. These are the top 2 concerns. And this concern is more pronounced among female-headed households. They're afraid they cannot provide enough food for their children, and they're afraid that the children would not get access to proper education. And this affects the mental health. It's been mentioned that we're not only facing health pandemic in terms of COVID, also but mental health. We find it is reported that 30%, 1 in 5 are depressed. In particular, among female-headed households, 1 in 4 are depressed. We suspect this is an understatement because many do not report, even the general public do not know that there are stress among female is much higher. And this study, we asked them, this is the first time we asked them, would you need parenting advice? Majority, 2 out of 3 said, yes, we need parenting advice. So within 1 year, we cannot cope with childcare, with work, with taking care of families. We need help. It was quite striking to me because we did not find this during the earlier studies. But now I think the families is up to here, and it's a clarion call that they need parental assistance. So emotional, mental health emotionally affect the families as well as affect the children. One respondent said, dia jadi marah tak tu pasal melenting, emosi tidak stable. So it's quite striking the impact to mental health after a year of MCO. We also asked about public healthcare facilities. This is one thing that we are extremely proud that public health system in terms of providing antenatal and postnatal care service works. It works in Malaysian education facilities. On these 2 issues work before and works now, especially during crisis, and something that we should be proud of. After the impact on income, impact on education, impact on mental health, we asked them, how do you expect, we asked them about the future. How do you think your financial situation is going to be in the next 6 months? Majority thinks it would stay the same. Only 1 out of 10 is optimistic in the future. So majority thinks it will not change, which is also a challenge because the current situation is not conducive to these families. Then we ask, what short-term assistance do you need the most right now? And majority, 7 out of 10 say we need cash assistance. And when we ask again, who should receive it? Majority, 1 in 2 said you should give cash assistance to those most vulnerable, to children, person with disability, and older elderly in low income household. This is something which is, to me, I feel is quite heartwarming, even though they're in a difficult situation, and yet they say you give assistance to those who need it the most. When we spend some time with one elderly woman who, when we calculate below poverty line, she said, you don't give it to me, it's fine. There are others who need it the most, even though she also in the vulnerable group. This is something this crisis brings out, caring society of among these households. We also took this opportunity to ask about vaccine. We ask, do you vaccinate your children? 9 in 10 almost all vaccinate their children. Then we ask, would you vaccinate yourself? You take COVID-19 vaccine? 6 in 10 say yes, but 4 in 10 says no or unsure. When we ask why not, we have a preconceived mind. Sometimes they do not want to take because halal issues. It's not true. Many of them, 4 of 10, they're unsure if vaccine is safe, and they're unsure about the side effect of vaccine. About halal is a small minority. So this is an issue. We need to ensure that this community also get vaccinated. I'll skip. What then? What do we do? What are the policy recommendations? We have 5 policy recommendations. Later during panel session, we will expand on this. Number 1, we need to strengthen social protection and labor market intervention, especially towards self-employed. Number 2, we need to enhance systems that ensure equity within education. All children, regardless of income, class, location, should have access to quality education. And this also involves access to nutritional meal. Every year, every day, when school open, a lot of kids benefit from rancangan makanan tambahan. But when school is closed, they do not get that anymore. And number 3, we know that mental health becomes an issue. There are needs to improve mental health services. Point number 4, there is need to expand services which tend to be gender-based violence and violence against children. And number 5, finally, is about ensuring inclusiveness in terms of vaccination. Let me end with this. It has been 1 year that we spent time with this family. I would share later, maybe in the panel session, what are the key insights that we get, and me personally from undertaking this and to the team. But we hope that this research, this input, this report will be able to support government initiative, government effort to mitigate the direct and indirect impact to the most vulnerable. And hopefully it will be incorporated, some of the suggestions and insight can be incorporated in the designing and improvement of the 12th Malaysian Plan so that everybody in Malaysia will have a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohamed. Ladies and gentlemen, members of distinguished guests, right? So as in the interest of time, I think we are quite on time, but in the interest of time, I will now invite Mr. Stephen Barrett, Chief of Social Policy, and his members of panelists to begin the next moderated session, a panel moderated session. And I would really urge all the audience to hold on to your questions. If you have any questions, you can put them on the chat, but if you want to ask your questions verbally, kindly hold on to your questions. And right after the moderated panel sessions, we will open the floor for Q&A time. Mr. Stephen, pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you to all the previous speakers. So as Dr. Mohamed said, we've now come to almost the end of almost a year of work on the Families on the Edge project, and now seems an appropriate time to take a step back and consider what we've learned and the extent to which the Families on the Edge study resonates with other evidence and experiences in the country. Although the Family on the Edge series of reports are all inherently backward-looking, we also want to take the opportunity to look forward a little bit and think about what the implications for the future are. To do this, I'm joined by 3 expert panelists, and I have a couple of questions for each of those panelists to get us rolling. And then after that discussion, the floor will be opened to further questions. So let me start off by introducing our panelists, and let me start with our lead researcher, Dr. Mohamed Abdul Khalid. Many of you will know Dr. Mohamed. He's a well-known Malaysian economist with extensive research and public policy experience. His previous appointments have included working as the economic advisor to the Prime Minister, leadership of the Council of Eminent Persons Secretariat, and also as research director in the Khazanah Research Institute, amongst many others. Joining him is Dato Dr. Narima Binti Awin, a public health physician who, prior to her retirement from public service, served as the Director of Family Health Development in the Ministry of Health in Malaysia. From 2008 to 2013, she served as the World Health Organization's Regional Advisor for Maternal and Reproductive Health, first for the Western Pacific region and then for the Southeast Asia region. Currently, she's attached to UNFPA in Malaysia as a technical advisor on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And finally, I'm very happy to welcome Catherine Anila, who joins us as a member of the steering committee for the Child Rights Coalition Malaysia, which is a relatively new civil society coalition comprising 42 child rights focused organisations from across the country. Catherine started her journey as a child advocate when she was only 11 years old with the Childline Foundation, and today she focuses on the creation of spaces for child participation and champions digital resilience. In 2018, Catherine founded Vanguards for Change, a youth-led NGO with young people ranging from age 10 to 21 years who are passionate about child rights advocacy and digital. Great stuff. So hopefully I've got my panelists there. I do. Welcome to you all. Let me start off with Dr. Mohamed. Start off with quite a high-level question for you, Dr. Mohamed. Around the world, COVID-19 has resulted in many families that had not previously been benefiting from social protection in the past, suddenly needing to do so. And I think that's also been the case in Malaysia with the BPN that extended eligibility for government income support for the first time, for some families. And as this has happened, many assumptions about poor families and recipients of social welfare have come under closer scrutiny. And there's been some evidence of increased public demand for social protection. And there's also been a shift to broader, more inclusive social policies in some countries. And I think, you think about the much talked about expansion of the child tax credit in the US recently, being perhaps the most prominent example in recent months. So my question to you is, to what extent do the findings from Families on the Edge challenge the dominant discourse on poverty and vulnerability in Malaysia? And how can we use the findings from this study and others to change perceptions and build consensus for a more progressive social policy framework in the country? Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Yes, at the past 1 year, when we undertake the study, we spend time with the families. This study has dispelled many myths about the poor and how they use the benefits or the assistance. In particular, and we reported this in the first and second report, we find that they work longer hours than average Malaysians. And the idea is that they are lazy, they're just waiting for assistance is not true at all. Even the second and third report, those who lost their job, Makcik Kia, for instance, or Pakcik, what do you do? They try to do other things to get incomes. They don't sit idle. So the idea that sometimes they're lazy, they're just waiting, is not true at all. Number two, we think it's best not to give cash assistance because they do not know how to use it. Again, this is not true. We find when we ask them, what do you use this money for? Two things come up. We do not find any abuse, major abuse. We do not. We find that spend money for household expenses, mostly on barang-barang basah untuk beli barang makanan. And number two, they spend a lot on their children. And the idea, sometimes we think that poor do not pay attention to children. Education is not true. Sizable household expenses is towards children education. So to say that they're not rational, they do not know how to use cash assistance, and therefore we put conditions, it's best not to use cash. It's not true at all. They're very rational. In fact, there are more, the financial literacy among them is much better than many of us. And number three, we find them that they're also very caring. And there's two instances that I can share with you. Number one, when the issues of I cannot monitor my children online learning, we find the evidence that the neighbors will come and help. Rotate. There's even neighbors across ethnic groups that come and help. I monitor your children while you go to work or you have to do household work. This is something beautiful, and we should share this. They care about each other. There's one, I like to tell the story, there's one makcik who got 80 kilos of beras because we don't believe in giving cash. We think, oh, they do not know how to use. I better give beras. Makcik said, I don't need beras. I said, Makcik, what do you use this beras for, or this rice? I said, I give it to my neighbors, those who need it. This is a caring society, a very rational society who's very hardworking. This study, and this is repeated in other studies around the world, that shows that the poor is a rational group. They know how to use this money rationally and optimally for the benefit of the families. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting because that resonates with some other evidence that shows that things like expenditure on some of the things we worry about, cigarettes, alcohol, those tend to increase when families are under stress. And I saw a study from the States recently where increases in reliability, increases in social welfare payments, which reduced financial insecurity and reduced the stress on the family, actually resulted in reduced expenditures on those types of items. So I think it's really important to understand the link between financial security, mental stress, and some of these unwanted behaviours. Okay. Let me move on to Dato' Nerima. Dato' Nerima, one of the standout findings from the latest survey is the high proportion of women, especially female heads of households, who are facing mental health problems, depression, anxiety, etc. And again, turning to other research, I saw in March that academics from the University of Malaya published a study which showed even higher levels of mental health, ill health amongst women, and they found higher rates amongst youth, women, and people from lower income backgrounds. So, that's my question to you is, what is causing these mental health challenges amongst these families? And of course, the minister mentioned in his speech the launch of new mental health services. What do we need to do to ensure that women access the support and services that they need? You're muted, Dato' Nerima.
Thank you, Stephen. It's very significant that you quoted other studies as well on mental prevalence in this country, because as you know, research is research, so we can get all kinds of different samples being used. As to why this problem is occurring, I think we cannot deny the fact that with modern living, the stresses and strains of life has really multiplied over the years. And one factor I notice is that I think the public is not very much aware of the problem, of the importance of keeping mental health, optimal mental health. So there is this unawareness. Another thing is because of social stigmatization. So some people in the past, they did not want to admit the fact that they have a mental illness, so that they keep it under wraps because of stigmatization. And of course, many people don't have the opportunity to get screened or to get diagnosed. And I also find that social norms, what is normal is so culturally determined. In one community, being depressed is something that you have to accept it as a fact of life. But in this particular case, Stephen, is so clear that it is the COVID crisis, it is the MCO that has added onto the stress. And remember, we are doing the study in low-income families. And we all know, and we have discussed this many times, as a public health specialist, I'll be the first to recognize the fact that the biggest, greatest, strongest determinant of health, including mental health, is economy. So it is not just that health is wealth, wealth is health as well. So the stresses of poverty is really, really great during this crisis. And Dr. Mohamed have also highlighted the fact that it is worse in female-headed household. So it is really being a single-head household is an additional risk factor. Now, whether the prevalence that we found 1 in 5 and 1 in 4, you compare that to University of Malaya study. And if I compare to the National Health and Morbidity Survey, the last one was done to 2019-2020, it's really not very different as well. But very significantly in the health morbidity study, when I first did it in 1996, I was the director in that institute at that time, the prevalence of mental illness was such and such. In the last one, it came up to almost 30%, like 1 in 3. And that is a huge increase from what it used to be. Before, I think 30 years ago, it was just 1/3 of that. And we also know that if we do the profiling by income group, mental illnesses in the poor is higher, not very much higher, but it's 9% the prevalence, whereas in the next, there is the B40, the next one is 8%. So poverty is also a factor here. About gender differentials, I think overall mental illness, there isn't much gender differentials. If you categorize it, I think there are differences. I think suicide is probably more in men than in women, but depression is certainly more in women than in men. In fact, if you look at universal data, they say women are 6 times more prone to depression than men, also anxiety disorders. So especially if you are female-headed household. Stephen, if you give me 2 minutes, I just remembered something about gender differentials. When I was still in the Ministry of Health, we were preparing, I think it was the 8th Malaysia Plan. We commissioned a consultant to look at the leading morbidities among men and women in Malaysia. The leading 10 causes of morbidity among men were 1, 2, 3, of course, cancer, heart disease. Number 6 or number 7 was hearing loss. And then when they look at the female profile, same thing, cancer, heart disease, there was no hearing loss. Number 8 and number 9 was depression. And I told the consultant, I find that very interesting, that the women are depressed and the men have hearing loss. Can I relate this together? Could it be because the men are not hearing and therefore the women are depressed? And I asked him, can you do a second study for this? Ask these men who claim to be peka, not to be having hearing loss. Are they really peka or are they pretending to be deaf? And that's why the women are depressed. So gender differences, to repeat, depression, yes. I mean, it's rather funny. Depression, yes, women are more depressed. In this study, Mohammed has highlighted that we are worried about the children. The children are also depressed. And I think the researcher, Mohammed, if I remember you having this conversation with me, one child even went up to say to the researcher and said, bayangkan kami ini orang miskin. I'm from a poor family. That means, will my future be bleak? Because the other children who are not poor, they're having computers at home. They're not missing school, whereas I am missing school. I don't have a laptop at home. I'm sharing this handphone with 3 other siblings. So that is to me a very, very clear sign of impending mental problems among the children. And I like to end by saying, Stephen, that the women who are depressed, about the 1 in 5, and this is during a crisis of COVID, of lockdown, they cannot go out, they have money problem. I have hopes, and I think my hypothesis is that when the crisis is over, there's likelihood that they will recover, the adults. But for the children, we must be very, very, very worried. It's probably very, very long term, probably even permanent. And I would appeal to the government to really put in interventions for the future generation to really look at mental health issues of children, especially in the poor families, and make sure the interventions are right now. And I don't have any more time to talk about this, and I don't like to point fingers, but I think the education system and the school Ministry of Education has a lot to do. I think our schooling system is not the best for mental health children. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Dato' Narima. It's very timely you brought us onto the topic of schools there. Catherine, with yesterday's announcement of the 3rd MCO and new nationwide school closures, the impact of the crisis on children's education once again comes to the fore of everyone's mind, particularly in parents, even myself with my kids at home. FOE has consistently highlighted challenges that children in low-income families are facing accessing learning. I also, throughout this crisis, Malaysia is not the only country generating research, and we started to see research coming out from other higher income countries, which Malaysia is aspiring to be, showing that even there, low income families are being disproportionately affected by the delays to education. So things like delays to language development. In the UK this week, a study showing that math skills amongst low income children are lower, have degraded faster than their higher income counterparts. So, to what extent, do you think these effects are arising in Malaysia? And what more do you think can be done to support low-income children to continue their learning and ensure that they don't fall further behind?
Thank you, Stephen. I think COVID-19 didn't cause these effects. These effects have started long before the pandemic, and the pandemic just amplified it. And now it is so blatantly obvious that we have to do something about it, right? Now, as what Dr. Nurima mentioned earlier, I think providing internet or mobile data or digital devices or gadgets for children, it is a good step. It really is. It is vital, but that alone isn't enough. When we provide these gadgets for children, it is also important that we teach the children how to use it. Digital resilience is so important and so underlooked nowadays. Because, for example, I myself as a student, I have at least 8 to 10 hours of screen time per day. And this is a cause for concern, because that is just for me. Imagine children who are just starting to develop, physically with their eyesight and everything. So screen time and getting overwhelmed with social media consumption, all these things it all relates to digital resilience. And that is why it is so important for children to be aware and to be empowered enough to be able to use the devices that are given to them. And as for education, as mentioned earlier, education has to be more than just academic education. And what needs to be done right now is that more than the academic education that is being taught online, more than the co-curricular activities that we're trying to implement online via virtual classes, I think what is very needed right now is mental health awareness and also emotional resilience that has to be taught in schools by the teachers. It is needed now more than ever. And the least we can do right now is to equip teachers first, for teachers to understand what mental health is, to be aware of it, and to have enough knowledge to be able to cater to children, especially now through online learning, to understand that all of us, regardless of whether we're children or adults, whoever, we are all facing a lot of mental health related issues because of what's happening around us.
Thank you, Catherine. I thought, as you were talking there, your reference to eyesight immediately just made me think about something in my own household. My eyes have deteriorated over the past year using screens every day, and my son, for the first time yesterday, I heard him just mention his eyes have got worse. And I think your point that children spending 8 or 9 hours a day maybe on screens is something we haven't really thought through around, and just something that struck me. And I hadn't. Yeah,
it's a coincidence also. Because just yesterday I went to check my eyes and I had to change my glasses because this isn't enough for the amount of screen time I have.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So I now want to turn back to Dr. Nurima, actually. The researchers interviewed a number of women who were looking after elderly members, and I think if you look at the profile of the study participants, many of these families are intergenerational households. You have more than 3 generations, including elderly family members who are being cared for by other adults and sometimes children in those families. How widespread is this phenomenon among low-income families in Malaysia, in your view? And what do you think are the implications for Malaysia's efforts to eradicate poverty? And finally, how can we lighten the load, particularly for female caregivers, especially those caring for people with chronic diseases and other infirmities? Over to you. You're muted again, Dr. Nurima. It's okay. We're all doing it still a year and a half into this crisis.
Yeah, I know. Okay, Stephen. Now, if you really look at one of the most significant phenomenon in the last century is population aging, and all countries are grappling with this. Now, for the Western world, for Europe, for Australia, they became rich, then they became old. But for us, we are rapidly aging. We are aging, we are getting old before we become rich. So poorer countries have a very, very difficult thing, a very, very difficult problem to solve because we're aging and we're still not rich. Now, about the segments in the population, the rich and the poor, I don't think that's much different in the demographic changes among the rich and the poor. However, you are right. the impact on the poor is much more worse than impact on the rich, because the poor just have less resources to get help to look after the elderly. And in this Families on Age, Dr. Mohamed and his team, and I reviewed 2 of the respondents whom they interviewed. It was very interesting what you say intergenerational, because these were elderly women themselves who look after another elderly. And sometimes you see them looking after 3 different elderlies. A 60-year-old woman could be looking after a 70-year-old husband and a 90-year-old mother and a 97-year-old mother-in-law or whatever. So this, and you can imagine the stress and the burden this gives onto the poor. So talking about aging and women and talking about poverty, I have always used this as a very interesting thing, what I call the triple jeopardy. Look, we live in a patriarchal society. It's still a lot better to be a man than to be a woman. By the way, women, we outlive you men by a few years. We live longer than men, but we suffer a lot more than men, and we suffer largely because of men. Okay, so being a woman is a jeopardy. Being poor is horrible. Being old, so can you imagine this triple jeopardy? Being a woman, being old, and being poor. A poor old woman has a lot of burden to bear. So in this study that we did, these 2 women who are elderly themselves and looking after their elderly husbands who happen to have morbid conditions, I think both were diabetics, and they needed money to buy the medicine. Look, and these women, they had the normal domestic functions to carry out. The children who were not going to school or grandchildren are now at home. They have to cook for these children. They did not have enough laptops to do online learning. And this woman in normal times could be the Makcik Kia. She sold nasi lemak, she sold goreng pisang to supplement the family's income. And now they have to look after another old person who happens to be having a morbidity. Imagine if she also has a person with disability. So you can see the jeopardies being multiplied at every level. So, and maybe I should, we don't have time. Maybe I should end by saying that these women who are old themselves, looking after old people, what are they doing? They're doing unpaid care work. There is the unpaid economy. They do so much. They contribute so much. And we do not even put the calculations in the economy, in the wealth of the nation, the GDP, the GNP of Malaysia, the contribution of these women who look after the elderly, who look after the sick husband, who look after the grandchildren, who sell nasi lemak, who do so much, who does the laundry. So that's not very, and as Dr. Rashid has said in his opening speech and Dr. Mohamed has given in his findings, there's hardly any social protection. And of course, they hardly have any savings. They're poor to begin with. And I'd like to mention one thing before I end that, yes, Dr. Mohamed, I agree with you. We believe that it is better to teach a man how to do fishing than to give him a fish so that he eats forever. However, in this COVID crisis, in these PPR flats, in this B40 low-income family, they need the fish. We have to give them the fish. So all those bantuan daripada kerajaan must continue because whilst we teach them how to do fishing, they are in dire need. So this is something that I would like to remind the government. There's a lot more. I know the government, the previous government at least introduced Suri. We don't have time to talk about Suri. I found that one of the very good interventions that has promised that women who are not working, if they contribute to the Suri EPF scheme, we don't have to talk about that today. And finally, if their children's education are secured, if the children of poor family can get as good education as the people as children from rich families, the future is brighter. They will be contributing to the economy for their parents and their grandparents. Okay, Stephen?
Thank you very much, Doctor. Catherine, back to you. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit already, but let's go back to this issue of mental health among children. Again, internationally, we've seen these evidence. I mean, for example, increased incidents of self-harm being reported in hospital emergency departments in different parts of the world. And in this data here, I I was quite shocked to see 1 in 2 families reporting that they believe their children's mental health has been affected over the past year, with 60% of parents saying that they need parenting support. Did this shock you, or does this resonate with what CRCM's members are finding on the ground? How do you feel about those findings?
Honestly, it did not shock me, because we are aware that the mental health of everyone is deteriorating. Now, I just like to make a comparison between 2 researchers. One is a statistic from the National Health and Morbidity Survey, which was conducted in 2019, before the pandemic. Now, in that survey, it was mentioned that 1 in 10 5 to 15-year-olds, right? 1 in 10 children have depression. And more often than not, that depression was a result of poor interaction with peers and whatnot. Now, fast forward a year later, okay, statistics from Child Helpline International said that 1 in 5, okay, that has dropped by half now, 1 in 5 children and young people. And this range is larger. It's from like 10 to 25-year-old people, right? 1 in 5 of these children and young people have either contemplated or even attempted suicide. Now, this has shown us, it just showed us the range of how extreme mental health has come to. And of course, there is more data. And if you'd like to know more data from the Child Rights Coalition Malaysia, you can also access our status reports from 2018 and 2019. Now, for Child Rights Coalition Malaysia, we, not just us, but I think all of us here, we see children's development, a child's development, it is seen holistically, mental and psychological health included. And if that's the case, then the closest interaction that the child has right now would be the parents and the teachers. Parents, because we're all stuck within the same 4 walls. And so it is all the more important for parents to be educated and to be empowered themselves on what mental health is, for them to understand their own mental health in order for them to understand their children's mental health. And on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, teachers should also understand, because I completely, not completely, but I understand and empathize with the amount of stress and pressure that teachers themselves have to go through with online learning. It's not just the children. And that is why it is important for teachers to also understand what the effects and causes of mental health is. I think all in all, mental health just needs to be talked about more. It really needs to be included in as many conversations possible, because it has to be acknowledged and not trivialized. Because as Dr. Narima mentioned earlier, so much of our norms is attributed to culture. And that also includes mental health, because so much of mental health is trivialized as being lazy, as being something that can be done or treated, but you just do not want to. But that isn't the reality, and that has to be acknowledged.
Right. Okay, so we're drawing to the close on this session now. I'm going to come back to Dr. Mohamed. And again, to sort of take a step back, Families on the Edge was conceived and intended to fill an evidence gap. We had this, of course, we knew the situation at the aggregate level on unemployment and these sorts of things, but we wanted to investigate the impact on vulnerable families, because that's what's needed if you're to design policies to ensure that children and others are not left behind. And of course, in the post-COVID context, there's going to be fewer financial resources available. So that seems to suggest that delivering on things like the SDGs and Malaysia's national development targets needs more focus on evidence-based policy making. So my question for you, given your experience in government and experience in the policymaking circles for many years now, is to what extent do you think that evidence effectively supports policy and programming in Malaysia at present, and what more can be done to improve this under the 12th Malaysia Plan?
Okay, thank you. I'm not muted. Thank you, Stephen. We design policy based on evidence. If you look at the current SOPs, probably it's not. We clearly do not use evidence. But if you look in terms of policy, in terms of social protection, for instance, it does. The senior officers or the officers in the Ministry of Women in particular, they're extremely professional. They know what is happening. And I think some of the solutions that they try to do or they have done are based on evidence. I give example, and Dr. Rahimah mentioned earlier on ISUI, that's based on evidence that women need to be protected. There are two examples when the government, especially Ministry of Women, the officers, use evidence extensively. Number one, when we realized that the malnutrition becomes serious issues. I think in 2018, they did a pilot on free breakfast program. 2019, they want to expand it, and I think they expanded to 100 schools with the objective of making it universal. That was the idea, because they realized a lot of children, the incident of malnutrition become more serious. Number one. And number two, we look at Bantuan Sara Hidup, BRIM that become BSH. Before, it did not take into account number of children. And when they realized that the best assistance is towards the children, the assistance is being tweaked based on number of children that you have. So it helped the children. And again, this based on evidence which were implemented by the government back then. So there are evidence that we used to design policy. And Stephen, when we do this for the past 1 year in other studies, we find that the interest among government officers to solve these issues were there. They're very committed. Even when we're designing this, we know some of the policies that they want to introduce, the intervention of 1,000 days from parole until the kids is 2 years. It's based on the evidence. Maybe, and I think this is one of the recommendations that we gave much earlier, that social assistance program should be consolidated. We have too many. I think 10, 15 years ago, we have about 100 programs. As of right now, we have about 198 programs to support social assistance and social protection. It's too many. Maybe it's time to streamline so that it becomes more focused and it's more effective. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohamed. Okay, so thank you to all three of you for helping us contextualize the study. I think when I think back to when we started, planning this study, none of us could have imagined that we would be talking about MCO 3.0 in May 2021. I think when I first started talking to Dr. Mohamed about this, we were thinking about a 6-month study, maybe 9 months, and look where we are now. And I think, with the rates of vaccine hesitancy that this study and others suggests, it seems like we're clearly not out of the woods on this. And all this seems to suggest to me that this real world game of snakes and ladders is not going away anytime soon. And, I think this protracted uncertainty and economic insecurity, we're now starting to see what the mental health study that I cited earlier on talked about, the cumulative mental health burden of over a year of insecurity for amongst low-income families. And I think this issue is often underappreciated in conversations around poverty. So I really hope that Families on the Edge has helped shine a light into some dimmer corners of the conversations on poverty and inequities in Malaysia. Now, all of this, from my perspective, seems to call for re-energizing public, private, and civil society responses. We had a lot of, when this was a short-term crisis, a lot of energy was invested early on, and I think we're turning into quite a protracted situation. And we need to transfer some of the innovation that took place in those early responses and maybe inject that into the longer-term planning processes so that we start addressing things like mental health, things like nutrition, things like equity in education, more sustainably and systemically going forward. Because I think that what Families on the Edge tells us is that if we don't, it seems inevitable that the socioeconomic disparities that existed prior to the crisis will widen. And what does that mean? It means human and productive potential will be lost. And I'm sure that, as you said, Dr. Mohamed, that government agencies will be keenly aware of that. And some of them are on this call. We've had multiple conversations with them during the course of this project. And I'm very confident that these things will be taken into account during the design of the 12th Malaysia Plan, the new child policy, for example, that's being developed. So I think, clearly this is attention is being paid, and that needs to continue. So thank you very much to all three of you. I'm now going to hand back to Adam, and I think we have some questions from other webinar participants. Adam, back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think before we let you and your fellow panelists go, I will look at the chat box if there is one question here. It's not directed at any member of the panelists, but it says, does this study look at the available community resources within this urban poor group with which we can harness as part of recovery? Does this study look at available community resources which we can harness as part of recovery? So that's the question from me. I'm not sure how you want to do this. Maybe we can ask Rachel if there are any questions from the press on her side to the panelists. Rachel?
Hi. No, so far no questions from the media yet. Hi, friends. Do any of you have any questions and would like to speak? Ask in the open forum. You can raise your hand and unmute yourself. Yes, it's Annabelle. Do you want to unmute yourself to ask? Let us know who you are addressing the questions to as well. Thanks, Annabelle. Annabelle from Malaysiakini.
Yeah. Annabelle from Malaysiakini here. My question is for Dr. Mohamed Khalid. In the statistic that you showed us, 1 in 4 female-headed households say that they are depressed. I looked at the chart. So it seems the percentage in September, it was 22% of female-headed households who said that they were depressed, and then in December it went up to 38%, and in March it went down to 28%. Is there a reason for that difference? That's the first question. And the second part of it is, with MCO 3.0 right now, how do you expect these households to feel with MCO 3.0? Yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
All right, Stephen, over to you and your panelists.
So I think we need to kick those in the first instance back to Dr. Mohamed. I know also the first question as well, we can maybe deal with that around community resources. I think earlier rounds of the survey we did look at the role that Zakat played and other civil society organisations. So maybe have some reflections from the study or more broadly, and also other panelists feel free to jump in.
Okay, maybe I'll answer Annabelle's question first. When we look at the mental health, something coincidence with the impact of MCO. When you stay at home, you cannot go out, you tend to see the number goes up. But overall, what is striking that the level of mental health is consistently relatively high. Because we have faced it for the past 1 year. Even when school is open, they are stressed, because when kids in school, they have issues either they can afford following SOP, they're worried either the kids will be safe or not, they're worried either they can afford face masks. And when the kids not in school, the kids at home, also they're worried about access to online learning, about providing quality education, about giving a nutritional meal. So Stephen mentioned this also earlier, even before crisis, they're already in vulnerable position. Now crisis make it much, much worse. Would MCO 3, what would the impact of MCO 3? We know when MCO, everybody at the house. And for many of these people, when we look at the statistics, many of them becoming more self-employed. Now you cannot do business. it's difficult to do business, especially for small time, yang bekerja sendiri, makcik kia bekerja sendiri. So there'll be income, fiscal constraint. Of course, you're going to get stressed. Now school are closed, you're going to get stressed again. And the worst part is that you've been stressed for the past 1 year. Where is the breaking point? That is, I think, the major concern. The comment from the respondent that we need help. 2 out of 3 said we need parenting advice. It shows that they are up to here. I think among all the recommendations, if you have to choose which one you have to prioritize, I think that should come among the top 3. Mental health going to have a strong long-term implication on the families. And like Dr. Nariman said, if you don't address this, you're going to have an impact in the long run. If you don't address education now, in the end, you're going to have very unequal society. A small group would do well, but majority will not do well. It can become society, Melayu kata, antara dua darjat. I think this needs to be, Dr. Iman mentioned this many times, it needs to be paid attention to. We have the money, we have the resources, and it should be used towards solving this problem. The issue, what are community resources? Yes, community, if you take in the formal way, in terms of zakat helps from the first until the third, even the earlier study in 2018 on children without zakat did help. But informally, we find that the resources that they use, their work, the cohesion there is extremely strong. In the second study that we did, the first study during MCO, they said, we minimize the costs. Nak pergi market because not everybody can go. We say only this today you go, next day you go, third day you go. So demobilize. There's social cohesion. When they have to work, the neighbor come or the neighbor kids come and teach them. I think that is a beautiful thing that we should promote and the benefit of this family. Dr. Nima want to say something? You have to unmute, Dr. Nima. Unmute. Or Adam has to unmute.
Okay, community resources. I found that a very, very interesting. Again, I'm wearing my public health specialist hat, where community resource mobilization is such an important intervention. And I think, Dr. Mohamed, you did say when you were presenting the results that there was a woman who was saying that I get help from my neighbor. So in many, many poor urban families all over the world that I've seen. This was very famous, I think it was in Santiago, Chile, where they have what they call mutual exchanges. So I think mutual exchanges is a very universal feature of urban poor. It's like, okay, I have a garden behind my house, I grow kacang panjang, I will give you my long beans, but you look after my baby. So that kind of mutual exchanges do work. So that's very self-resilient community resource mobilization, to whoever asked that question earlier on. There are certain areas I've seen around the world that there could be NGOs who mobilize resources for them. So it's not self, but that NGO could be from within that poor community or within and outside. I can quote one example. I went to Bangalore. I saw, this was for elderly care, by the way. There were rich elderly people, men mainly, and their wives, who go 4 times a week to the poor squatter areas to help them with their problems. So it's a very loose kind of association that they help to mobilize, you know, they help them, they teach them how to mobilize their own resources. When I was in Myanmar, in the Nargis affected area, the huge tsunami, Nargis, the cyclone, and the Irrawaddy Delta, I was my heart was really warmed when I went to see that village. And there was this village group, they had very little money, but whatever little money they had, they pull it together in one coffer and they will help out with the other poor. And I managed to get an international donor, one of which was defeat, I think. So international donors came in to put into that coffer to help them have something steady before they could be self-resilient in community resources. To summarize, therefore, mobilization of community resources is a very, very important intervention in public health practice.
So, shall I answer the question from Straits Times?
I
can go.
Yeah, you can go there.
Yeah, I can go there. Maybe later if Stephen and Dr. Imam, the rest wants to add. The impact of MCO 3.0, there's slight difference with MCO 1.0 or MCO 2.0. The major difference is when we imposed MCO 1.0 and 2.0, there were extensive, in relative sense, a lot of government assistance. There were loan moratorium, there were cash assistance, there were grant for small business owner, and there wage subsidy. All these four, no more. For VPR, there are rental exemption and rental discount, no more extensively. Without this assistance, and remember, this is already 1 year, they already used up all the savings. We know that they borrowed the gadai the bone, and this MCO 3 would have a dire impact. I shudder to think what would happen. The impact of MCO 3.0 should be accompanied, the introduction of MCO 3.0 should be accompanied by government continued assistance. This is what the respondents say too. They need assistance. They must be accompanied by government assistance. Otherwise, we would do great injustice to these families.
Thank you, Dr. Mohamed.
The only thing I would add to that, so I mean, I think the Families on the Edge has shown that the sort of lump sum short-term responses that the government have provided through BPN or BPR as it is now have been critical, absolutely critical. But I think, you know, what we're seeing now, and the feedback that you're getting from the families, and you're seeing this in the sort of mental, this sort of grinding mental health impact, is the impact of uncertainty, insecurity. And I think we have to end that now. And we have to offer these families a longer term guarantee of financial security. And I know the government has been working on this. And of course, the 2021 budget included a commitment to a major extension of the core social protection programs to ensure that all, what was then in 2019 over 400,000 families below the poverty line, to ensure that the core social protection programs were extended at least to those families. I think we need to see that because we've got to give these families, returning to our snakes and ladders analogy, we've got to give them a ladder out of this situation. And I think sort of recurrent, unpredictable support, it keeps them in a holding pattern, but it's not providing them with the financial, but also the mental security that families need. And I think I go back right to the start of this conversation, where we're talking about the impact that financial insecurity has on mental health and on perverse behaviour. And that evidence is well established at the international level. And we're seeing the impact of insecurity on mental health here. That impact on mental health translates into, when it comes to children, in underperformance in school. Children cannot learn effectively in school if their mental health is suffering. So we've got to give these families more security. We've got to give them a way out. And I think, the dignity that these families have shown, the initiative that they have shown. I mean, Dr. Mohamed in his presentation showed how families have adopted more self-employment. They have diversified their income sources. They're trying their level best to work their way out of this crisis. And I think they just need that regular, reliable support and through strengthening of the mainstream social protection system. And that gives us an exit strategy for these COVID-19 responses. The stop-start COVID-19 emergency supports. We need to, let's say, end the insecurity and provide people with a ladder out here. And the international evidence is very, very strong for that.
Okay, the questions are coming in. There's one from Amnan for Dr. Mohamed. Would you like to answer that first? Read it out. Amnan from Sinar Harian, question for Dr. Mohamed about the ongoing government assistance that needs to be given to the low-income group. Is there any time period that needs to be allocated for such assistance?
I can answer a quick one. The time should be yesterday. So it should be now. Next question.
All right. From Mustaqim from Malaysia now. One of Help's the survey find is the monthly cash handouts. Is this something doable for now, considering that there will be more recipients after the pandemic than previously under JKM and or the Zakat list?
If they are vulnerable, if they meet the criteria, if they're affected, then they should be given a monthly cash handout. We know who they are, and I think we have to give credit to the government when they give out BPN. It covers a lot of recipients. Yeah? I think this should be continued. The issue of mistargeting very much minimized. We know who they are, and it has been done, and it should be done again.
Great. Any other questions?
One thing I would just come back to there, just an issue of language. You know, the first question I asked Dr. Mohamed is around rethinking social protection, and the word handout crops up a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it creates a bit of a problem, because the countries that have the most successful social protection programs and the ones that reduce, for example, child poverty most effectively, don't think of these things as handouts. It's not something that is within the charity model. It's something that is considered an investment in families, in children, and something that's closely, part of the policy fabric of society. It's an issue of solidarity. It's an issue of citizenship and membership of, as I said, investment in the future. So, I think we've got a lot of media representatives here, and I think the media plays a key role all over the world in promoting discussions and around social welfare. And the language that's used is very important, because it frames how people think about these things, and therefore what the policy options, the appropriate policy options that people are considered to be. So, as much as possible, I would hope that we move away from handouts. I mentioned the situation of the example of the US. The US has a very conservative welfare system. Everybody will know that. As part of the COVID recovery there, they've introduced a very, very broadly targeted child tax credit, which repositions the whole thing away from welfare handouts and dependency towards an investment in children and families, ensuring that all children have a decent standard of living, and that your parental income does not limit, as far as is possible, the opportunities that you have as a child and the human capital that you accumulate in childhood. So, I think wherever possible, we need to change the language, and then, as I say, policy options open up, and we can be much more ambitious about what the framework and supports that we provide for all Malaysians, and particularly all Malaysian children. Over.
Stefan, I just want to add one thing. Helping them, providing assistance is good for the economy. 1 ringgit, I like to say this: 1 ringgit in the hand of the poor is good for the economy. Because the economy's marginal prosperity to consume is almost 1. 1 ringgit, again, I will spend downstairs, kalau flat kat bawah tu untuk peniaga tu kalau dapat untung, dia boleh employ pekerja, boleh bayar tax. 1 ringgit spent on the poor is good for the economy, because the Malaysian economy is dependent on the people spending on private consumption, especially in the services sector. So it's not only help the family, but it also help the country to grow the economy. It's not a zero-sum game. You give to them, somebody else not going to get. No, you give to them, there's a lot of multi-employer, a good benefit to the society as a whole. I think this we need to remember, and we should promote. Over.
Thank you. Can we circle back to this question by Ram Anand? I don't think it was adequately addressed. So he asked, with relatively high vaccine hesitancy coupled with their socio-economic situation, will repeat MCOs threaten to put these vulnerable groups into a dangerous, never-ending cycle?
I think I did, and that's why I said that, of course, you put them in a never-ending cycle. Without government assistance, like I mentioned before, MCO 1, MCO, there were which subsidy, and I explained much earlier. It needs to, MCO 3.0 need to be accompanied by government assistance, regular and effective government assistance. Otherwise, in the long run, we're going to have a very unequal society. Those who do well from a well-to-do family, majority not going to do well. If, especially impact on education, if education is key towards upward mobility, you can equalize society through education. And now that opportunity is no longer given, or there's huge impediments towards having good quality education to low-income society, you will see impact in the long run. We will lose a big chunk of our human capital, and then we become a very unequal society. This is something we cannot afford. A country with multi-ethnic, multi-racial, we cannot afford. The intervention must be now, and if the issue is money, it's not true. We do not have money. We have money. We can afford to spend, and we should spend.
All right, thank you. Here's another question from Shafika. As we are now back in MCO PDPR, that's online learning or remote schooling, might be a disadvantage for students from low-income families. They do not have the gadgets and internet connections, so they might lag behind. What are some recommendations to improve home learnings for this group?
Who answering this, me or?
Who would like to answer this? Shafika, do you have anyone you'd like to answer this? This is about online learning.
Catherine can answer.
Okay. I don't know why, but this question made me think of the human analogy that was brought by sociologist Emil Durkheim. It basically, what it summed up, the human analogy means that, you know, we are all interconnected. All of us as individuals, you know, institutions, communities, we are all interconnected in one way or another. I thought of that because when this happens, it is not just one stakeholder that needs to take action. It is not just one government or one organization, but I think all of us have to play a part in it. For example, if we are looking at PPR communities, right, in the PPR flats, the head of the flat, for example, should also, I don't know, look at how many children need these kind of assistance and how they are able to provide it. And I am also aware that there are organizations or foundations that are giving out smartphones or devices, smartphones or laptops for children, for students. And there were bantuan, bantuan for university students, and I think for school students as well in terms of mobile data and whatnot. I'm not sure what the government aid is like right now, but as Dr. Mohamed pointed out earlier, for MCO 3.0, it's really not the same as the previous ones. But yeah, some of the recommendations to improve it could be reaching out for help. And if we know of someone who is in need of this help, we should also try as much as possible to use our network and our connections to try and, just bridge help with those that need help. Yeah.
Stephen, can I just add? Earlier on, I said, whilst you can teach a man how to do fishing, you still have to give him the fish in the short term. That same analogy I use here, I use a very simple, these children are in dire need. Why can't philanthropists get together? I notice we don't have enough philanthropy in this country. And you might accuse me of trying to be, well, it may not be sustainable, it is not self-reliant. Look, those people cannot be self-reliant. I look at that great guy in India, Azim Premji. Azim Premji donates $20 million every year just for education because he knows these are poor people. I have to help them. I have to buy their books for them. I have to buy their laptops for them before they can stand on their own 2 feet because they just can't stand on their own 2 feet. So I appeal to the rich people in Malaysia. There's so many rich people in Malaysia because I know some of my wealthier friends have bought laptops for the poor people in Kelantan. For students in Kelantan. I mean, I know a friend who bought 200 units, another friend who bought 300 units. So this kind of things, I hope, can help.
I mean, from my perspective, I'm not an education specialist, but I think one thing, if we look at the FOE data, there's access to. I think if we look at the story that emerged from the data over the past year, we started off talking about devices and the limit, and that's still a feature. But over time, other issues have started to emerge, and so the issue of parental, the ability of parents to support their children to engage in online learning. The issue of the, well, I mean, let's stick with that piece for a start. I don't know the extent to which there is a standard across schools for engaging parents in supporting them to support their children. I know, again, I keep citing international evidence here, but there's so much being generated in COVID. But just in the UK this week, there was a study which showed there's a huge variation amongst schools on the extent to which they follow up with children who are undertaking online learning. So you'll find in some schools, 26% of teachers calling their pupils once a week to check in on them on how things are going. In other schools, it was something like, far more. So I wondered whether there's time for, maybe the Ministry of Education is already thinking about this, to reflect on lessons learnt. What are the good practices? What are certain schools doing which is really working to support children with online learning? And how can that be replicated in other schools? We might find a huge diversity across schools, and some of that will be great. Diversity responds to context, and some of it will just be patchiness. And I think that there's an opportunity to do a rapid, best practice analysis and support schools to, engage parents in the learning process for their children, because we already know that parental engagement in education more broadly is a determinant of how well children do in school, and that factor will simply be elevated in a context of online learning, I'm sure. But Dr. Mohamed, do you have anything more to add on that?
No, especially for the urban poor, we know where these kids are. We know who do not have, who have concern, who have limitation on internet, on laptops. If we cannot provide, which shouldn't be any issue, we are a relatively rich country, we should provide. We know who they are, we know where they are. We should provide. If that takes time, understandably, maybe it takes time, you use education TV. It works. 60% say it works. 40% say there's an issue of the content kids don't understand. So you maximize that. If you look at the data, about 99%, even in Sabah, would have TV. Even in a remote area, they would have TV. So you optimize that until you can solve the access of internet and laptops. So we can promote this in the meantime until we give them proper education equipment. Thank you.
Rachel, how are we doing? Any more questions?
Thank you. No more questions from Annabelle. Thanks, Annabelle, for asking questions first. Yeah, so I think that's it from the media today. I would hand the time over to Adam. And if you have any questions or need further information, please let me, Andy, or Sufyan from UNFPA know for any interviews as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Rachel. Right. So thank you very much, fellow panelists, Mr. Stephen, for moderating it. Right. So I now open the floor to everyone who is in this session. If you have any questions, kindly just raise your hand or just put it in the chat group. Identify which organization do you represent and what's your question.
Or they can just send the questions to Rachel, to Andy, Adam, all we will answer them.
Yeah. Oh, we have compliments here from Dr. Kamalia. No. Say thank you so much for the panelists for a great engagement. Right. So I think let me just Yes.
Hi, sorry, I'm Noraida Andud,
yes.
one of the team members in the study. So I just want to say about education. I mean, I agree with Stephen that the issue for education is actually wider than just the availability of devices. I mean, the availability of devices is a very important issue based on the qualitative data. But also based on the qualitative data, there are other concerns, for example, really about managing the children at home, because a household may have, most of the household in the qualitative study, where there are children, there are more than 2 or 3 children in the house, school-going children. So the stressors for the mothers were actually managing the children at home in education, because they themselves do not know about, they don't have enough knowledge about the whole the homework and things like that, but also because of the lack of devices to go amongst the children. And also the inability to supervise. So sometimes older children will be asked to supervise younger children and so on. So I think there are deeper issues that need to be dealt with, other than giving devices and that's it. So I think there are more things to look here than just the issue of availability of devices. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noraida. Dr. Noraida helped us tremendously on the qualitative one. Okay, Adam.
Right. So, okay. Right. So I guess there's no more further questions. With that, I would like to thank you all, panelists, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, right, for participating in the launch of the final series of the Families on the Edge study. All information, the reports, as well as the executive summary will be made available on UNICEF website. If you have any further questions, you may address it to our comms correspondent, Ms. Rachel. Her contacts will also be available on our UNICEF Malaysia website. Once again, thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.